The date is February 14th, 1944, and the smell of hydraulic fluid and cigarette smoke hangs in the operations room at Derberitz like something physical, like a second atmosphere. Adolf Galland is standing over a map table when the telephone rings. He already knows, more or less, what it will say. The reports have been coming in since morning, fragmentary at first, then with the gathering coherence of something catastrophic taking shape. The Americans have crossed the German border in force. Not a raid, not a probe. A sustained, deep penetration bombing offensive, escorted all the way to the target and all the way back by fighters that have no business being there. Fighters that are doing something the Luftwaffe's own models had declared, with quiet institutional confidence, to be impossible. Galland picks up the telephone. The voice on the other end is not panicked. That is almost worse. It is the measured, clipped delivery of a man transmitting facts he himself cannot fully process. The Mustangs, the North American P-51s, have been seen over Berlin, not approaching Berlin, not within range of Berlin, over Berlin, circling, waiting. As though they own the airspace above the capital of the Reich and have simply decided to introduce themselves. Galland sets the phone down. What follows, the 7 days between February 20th and February 25th, 1944, the period the Americans would call Big Week and the Luftwaffe would not, officially, call anything, because naming it would require acknowledging what it was, would cost Germany something it could not replace. Not aircraft. Aircraft could be built. Not fuel, though fuel was already becoming a quiet crisis. What Germany would lose in those 7 days over the factories of Regensburg and Schweinfurt and Brunswick and Leipzig was the core of its experienced fighter pilot cadre. The men who knew how to do this, the men who had learned over 4 years of war the 10,000 small adjustments that keep a pilot alive in a turning fight at 25,000 feet with someone equally determined to kill him. Galland would survive the week. He would write about it carefully in the years that followed. And in those writings, between the operational analysis and the careful professional distance, there is one passage about American fighter pilots that stops you. Not because it is complimentary, though it is, because of what it reveals about the man writing it and what he understood, standing over that map table, the telephone still warm in his hand, that the people above him had not yet begun to grasp. Parte primera. La doctrina y el hombre que la cuestionó. Part 1. The doctrine and the man who questioned it. The Luftwaffe that went to war in September of 1939 was not, despite what post-war mythology would suggest, a strategic air force. It was a tactical one. It had been built to support ground operations, to destroy enemy airfields, disrupt supply lines, provide close air support to advancing panzer columns, and achieve local air superiority over a defined battle zone for a defined period. It was extraordinarily good at all of these things. The campaigns in Poland, Norway, France and the Low Countries had demonstrated this with a precision that stunned military observers worldwide. What the Luftwaffe had not been built to do was fight a prolonged attritional air campaign over an island nation with a functioning industrial base, a competent radar network, and a fighter force that refused to be destroyed on the ground. This is the structural fact that everything else follows from. The Battle of Britain, fought from the 10th of July to the 31st of October 1940, was the first major military campaign conducted entirely by air forces. It was also the first campaign in which the Luftwaffe encountered a problem its doctrine had no answer for. An enemy that could absorb punishment, regenerate, and keep fighting. The RAF and the Fleet Air Arm, defending the United Kingdom against waves of German bombers and their escorts, were not performing the way the Luftwaffe's models predicted. They kept showing up. Day after day, week after week, they kept showing up. Adolf Galland had been flying in that battle. He was 28 years old when it began, a Staffelkapitän commanding a fighter squadron equipped with Messerschmitt Bf 109s. He had learned to fly in gliders as a teenager, had flown covertly with the Condor Legion in Spain, had been wounded twice, and had developed a tactical instincts so precise that his kill confirmations read like a geometry problem. By the end of the Battle of Britain, he had 40 aerial victories. By the end of 1941, he had 94. By the time he was appointed General der Jagdflieger, commander of all German fighter forces, in December of 1941, at the age of 29, he had more practical knowledge of fighter versus fighter combat than almost any living officer on either side. He had also, during the Battle of Britain, noticed something that would take him 2 more years to fully articulate. The RAF's Spitfires were better than his Bf 109s in certain critical parameters. Not in all parameters. The 109 was faster in a dive, had fuel injection where the Spitfire's carburetor briefly cut out in negative G maneuvers, and could maintain a tighter turning radius at very high speed. But the Spitfire's rate of roll at medium speed was superior. Its pilot visibility was better. And its pilots, this was the detail Galland kept returning to. Its pilots were fighting over their own territory. Every RAF pilot who bailed out over England was back in a cockpit within 24 hours. Every Luftwaffe pilot who went down over the Channel or over England was gone. The arithmetic of attrition worked differently for the two sides, and Galland understood this with the clarity of a man who had watched his squadron's faces change week by week as the original pilots disappeared and were replaced by men with less and less experience. The Battle of Britain ended in German strategic failure. The RAF had not been destroyed. Operation Sea Lion, the planned seaborne invasion of Britain, was postponed indefinitely because the German High Command could not contemplate a cross-channel assault while the Royal Navy controlled the English Channel and the North Sea, and the Luftwaffe could not guarantee air superiority over the landing zones. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, in a speech to the House of Commons on the 18th of June 1940, had declared that the Battle of Britain was about to begin. He had been right about the battle. He had also been right, though he could not have known the full reasons yet about its outcome. Galland drew his conclusions from the battle and filed them away. The Luftwaffe's fighter force was superb. Its pilots were among the best trained in the world. Its aircraft were technically competitive. But the doctrine under which it operated, the doctrine that treated fighters as defensive tools, as escorts for bombers, as reactive rather than proactive instruments, was a doctrine that worked when you were winning and broke when you were not. And there was a deeper problem, one that Galland articulated with increasing frustration in the years that followed. The Luftwaffe's leadership did not understand fighters. Goering was a World War I fighter ace, but that had been 20 years ago, and what he understood about air combat in 1943 had the relationship to current reality that a cavalry officer's understanding of the charge had to the tank. Galland did not say this to Goering's face, not yet. He was a soldier, and soldiers in the Wehrmacht learned quickly that candor with superiors had a ceiling above which it became career-ending or worse. But he wrote it carefully in reports. He said it obliquely in briefings. And he began in the autumn of 1943 to say it more directly, because the Americans were coming in numbers that made obliqueness a luxury he could no longer afford. The Americans had been bombing Germany since August of 1942. The early raids had been small, tentative, and had not yet reached deep into the Reich. By the summer of 1943, the 8th Air Force was sending hundreds of Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses and consolidated B-24 Liberators deep into Germany, to Schweinfurt, to Regensburg, to Wiener Neustadt, in daylight raids that were supposed to demonstrate the doctrine of high-altitude precision daylight bombardment. The doctrine held that the bombers, flying in tight defensive formations, bristling with 50 caliber machine guns, could fight their way to and from any target without fighter escort. This was wrong. Catastrophically, demonstrably, quantifiably wrong. The first Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid on the 17th of August 1943 cost the 8th Air Force 60 B-17 out of 376 dispatched. 376 aircraft, 60 destroyed, 600 men killed or captured in a single afternoon. The second Schweinfurt raid on the 14th of October 1943, Black Thursday as it became known, cost another 60 bombers out of 291 dispatched. Deep penetration raids were suspended after Black Thursday. The losses were unsustainable. Stop and think about what that means. The most powerful air force the United States had ever put into the field, equipped with the best heavy bombers in the world, had been turned back. The Luftwaffe's fighter arm, despite everything, despite the attrition of the Eastern Front, despite the losses over North Africa, despite the constant drain of fighting a two-front air war, had proven that it could still inflict unacceptable losses on unescorted bombers attempting to reach targets deep inside Germany. Galland knew this. He also knew something his superiors did not want to hear. The suspension was temporary. The Americans would solve the escort problem, and when they did, everything would change. Part 2. The escort problem and the man who solved it. Meet Colonel Hubert Zemke. 30 years old in the autumn of 1943. Born in Missoula, Montana on the 14th of March 1914. The son of German immigrants, which gave him, as he noted in his memoirs with characteristic dryness, a certain personal interest in the outcome of the war. He had graduated from West Point in 1936, learned to fly at Randolph Field, Texas, and had spent time in Britain and the Soviet Union before the United States entered the war, studying foreign air forces and filing reports that his superiors initially found alarmist. He commanded the 56th Fighter Group, the Wolfpack, equipped with Republic P-47 Thunderbolts. The P-47 was not, at first glance, a natural escort fighter. It weighed 7.5 tons fully loaded. It was the largest and heaviest single-engine fighter produced by any nation during the war. Its radial engine produced 2,300 horsepower, which gave it exceptional speed and a rate of climb that surprised pilots who expected something the size of a Thunderbolt to wallow. But it was thirsty. At combat power settings, its range without drop tanks was limited to roughly 375 miles from base. That was enough to escort bombers to the Dutch coast and perhaps into the western fringe of Germany. It was not enough to reach Schweinfurt. Zemke knew this. He also knew something about the P-47 that the official performance charts did not fully capture. In the hands of a pilot who understood its characteristics, who knew that it dominated above 25,000 feet, that it could outdive almost anything the Luftwaffe flew, that its 850 caliber guns could destroy a Focke-Wulf 190 in a burst that lasted less than 2 seconds, it was a formidable weapon. The problem was not the aircraft. The problem was doctrine. American fighter escort doctrine in the summer of 1943 was built around one principle: stay with the bombers. Fighters flew close escort, weaving above the bomber formations, waiting for German fighters to attack. This was, from a tactical standpoint, almost perfectly wrong. It surrendered the initiative to the Luftwaffe. It forced American fighters to fly at the bombers' speed, slower than their optimal combat speed. It prevented the aggressive interception that could have broken up German attacks before they reached the formation. And it played directly into the hands of Luftwaffe tactical doctrine, which had evolved specifically to defeat exactly this kind of defensive escort posture. Galland's fighter arm had developed a system for attacking American bomber formations that was methodical and, within its constraints, very effective. German fighters would assemble in large formations, Gefechtsverbände, battle formations, at high altitude, then execute coordinated frontal attacks on the bomber boxes. The frontal attack was chosen because it presented the bomber's least effective defensive armament. The early B-17s had only a single nose gun, and because the closing speed of a head-on pass was so high that the defensive gunners had less than 2 seconds to track and fire. Simultaneously, other German fighters would attack from the rear and flanks to disrupt the formation and force the bombers to break their tight defensive boxes. A B-17 that broke formation was a B-17 that could be killed. This system worked. Against unescorted bombers, it worked with devastating efficiency. Against close escort fighters flying at reduced speed in a defensive posture, it worked almost as well, because the German fighters could choose when and where to engage, strike and disengage before the escorts could respond. What it could not survive, What Galland had understood for months and had been trying to explain in language his superiors could accept was an escort fighter that flew offensively. A fighter that did not wait for the Germans to attack. A fighter that went looking for the Luftwaffe's assembly points, that hit the battle formations before they could reach the bombers, that pursued and destroyed rather than waiting and reacting. This was not a new idea. It was, in fact, the oldest idea in fighter tactics: attack. But it required accepting a principle that American bomber doctrine found deeply uncomfortable: that the escort fighter's primary job was not to protect every individual bomber, but to destroy the German fighter force. That meant leaving the bombers temporarily unescorted to pursue and kill German fighters that were trying to disengage. It meant accepting that some bombers would be lost while the escorts were hunting. It meant prioritizing destruction of the enemy's offensive capability over the defensive protection of your own assets. Zemke understood this. He had been arguing for it since the summer of 1943. The 56th Fighter Group had been practicing it, within the constraints of official doctrine, on every mission they flew. His pilots, men like Francis Gabreski, 24 years old, from Oil City, Pennsylvania, who would end the war as the highest-scoring American ace in the European theatre with 28 aerial victories, had developed an aggressive, opportunistic style of combat that was beginning to produce results that stood out in the 8th Air Force's statistics. But the P-47's range problem remained. Close escort to the German border was the limit. Until that limit was solved, the deep penetration raids remained unescorted for the most dangerous portion of their route, the long hours over Germany itself, where Galland's fighters waited. The solution arrived in the autumn of 1943 in the form of a new aircraft and a new drop tank. That aircraft was the North American P-51 Mustang. Powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in its D variant, the P-51D had a combat range with drop tanks of roughly 1,375 miles. It could fly from bases in England to Berlin and back. It was also, in the assessment of virtually every pilot on both sides who flew against it, one of the finest fighter aircraft of the war. Fast, maneuverable, with exceptional high-altitude performance and a rate of climb that made it competitive with anything the Luftwaffe flew. Galland flew a captured P-51 in the autumn of 1943. His assessment, written in a report that circulated among senior Luftwaffe officers before being suppressed, was blunt. The P-51 was superior to the Bf-109 and the FW-190 at most altitudes and in most combat scenarios. It was not unbeatable, but it was very, very good. His superiors did not want to hear this. Goering, famously, told him to rewrite the report. Galland declined. This exchange, the report, the refusal, the growing gulf between what Galland was seeing in the air and what the Luftwaffe's leadership was telling Hitler, is the fault line that runs through everything that happened in the week of the 20th to the 25th of February 1944. Here is the key detail. By the beginning of 1944, the 8th Air Force had received enough P-51Bs and P-51Ds to begin equipping its fighter groups for long-range escort. The drop tank problem for the P-47 had also been partially solved. New 108-gallon paper composite drop tanks extended its range to the German border and slightly beyond. And a new commander had arrived to lead 8th Fighter Command, General James Doolittle, who had led the famous raid on Tokyo in April of 1942 and who had a very simple, very clear instruction for his fighter pilots. The instruction was, go find the Luftwaffe and destroy it. Not escort the bombers, not wait for the Germans to attack. Find them, pursue them, destroy them on the ground, in the air, at their airfields. The primary mission of 8th Fighter Command was now the destruction of the German fighter force as a fighting organization. This was the instruction that Galland had, in effect, been predicting for 2 years. He had known it was coming. He had been trying to prepare his force for it. And when it came, in the week of the 20th to the 25th of February 1944, it came with a weight and a precision that his preparation could not match. People like Galland, officers who told their superiors the truth when the truth was unwelcome, are rare in any army. He had been filing honest reports since 1941. He had been arguing for resources, for realistic doctrine, for the freedom to fight the air war the way the air war needed to be fought. He had been overruled, patronized, and told to rewrite his assessments. And if this investigation gives you a clearer picture of what the air war over Europe actually looked like, not the version that survived in official communiques, but the version that men like Galland were writing when they thought the right people might eventually read it, then press the like button. It helps keep this kind of history visible a little longer, and that matters. Part 3. Big Week, 20 to 25th of February, 1944. The meteorological window opened on the evening of the 19th of February, 1944. For weeks, the 8th Air Force and the newly arrived 15th Air Force, based in Italy, had been waiting for a stretch of clear weather over the German aircraft manufacturing centres. The targets had been selected with the same cold logic that had guided the Schweinfurt raids. Destroy the factories that built the fighters, and the Luftwaffe's fighter force would wither, regardless of how well it fought. The plan, Operation Argument, called for coordinated attacks on Messerschmitt's facilities at Regensburg and Augsburg, on the Focke-Wulf plant at Oschersleben, on aircraft component factories across central Germany, and on the airfields and infrastructure that supported Luftwaffe fighter operations. The 8th Air Force dispatched over the 6 days of Big Week approximately 3,300 bomber sorties and 3,500 fighter sorties. The 15th Air Force added approximately 500 bomber sorties from the south. The total tonnage of bombs dropped on German aircraft manufacturing facilities during those 6 days was greater than the entire tonnage dropped on Germany in the whole of 1943. But the bombs were not the most important thing that happened during Big Week. The most important thing was what the P-51s did. Meet Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Christian, 26 years old, from Montgomery, Alabama. He had played football at the University of Alabama before the war, had trained as a pilot at Maxwell Field, and was commanding a squadron of the 4th Fighter Group, the Eagle Squadron veterans, former RAF pilots who had transferred to the USAAF, equipped with P-51Bs. On the morning of the 20th of February 1944, Christian led his squadron east from Debden, Essex, at an altitude of 30,000 feet, past the Dutch coast, past the German border, past the point where the P-47s had always turned back. He kept going. Over central Germany, at altitudes where the Luftwaffe's Gefechtsverbände were assembling to attack the bomber stream, the P-51s arrived. The German pilots had a system. They knew how it worked. They assembled at high altitude, formed their battle formations, positioned themselves for the coordinated attack, and then, for the first time, found that the long-range escorts were already there. Not waiting above the bombers, up at altitude, where the Germans were forming, attacking before the attack could begin. The Luftwaffe's battle formation system depended on the ability to assemble undisturbed. A Gefechtsverband of 50 or 60 fighters formed up and coordinated was a devastating weapon against a bomber box. The same 50 or 60 fighters caught individually during the assembly process by aggressive long-range escorts were 50 or 60 individual aircraft that could be picked off one by one. This is what happened during Big Week. Day after day, over 6 consecutive days, the P-51s and P-47s, operating now with the new drop tanks and the new offensive doctrine, disrupted the assembly of German battle formations before they could reach the bombers. When German fighters did break through to the bomber stream, they found escorts that pursued them rather than waiting. When German fighters tried to disengage and land to refuel, they found P-47s and P-51s strafing their airfields. The numbers from those 6 days are worth sitting with. During Big Week, 97 heavy bombers and 28 fighters were lost. Those are real losses, real men, real machines. But the Luftwaffe lost approximately 260 fighters with pilots. Not aircraft that could be replaced in a week. Pilots. Experienced pilots. Men who had been flying since Spain or Poland or the Battle of Britain. Men whose knowledge of tactics and survival was irreplaceable by any training program that existed. The pilot replacement pipeline that the Luftwaffe had been running since 1942 was producing men who could take off and land. It was not producing men who could survive their first 3 missions against experienced American fighter pilots operating with long-range escorts and offensive doctrine. And here is what makes those 6 days the pivot of the entire air war. Those 97 lost bombers came from a pool of more than 500 B-17 and B-24s available to the 8th Air Force. That loss could be absorbed and the missions kept flying. The Luftwaffe's 260 experienced fighter pilots represented a wound the force could not recover from, not at the rate the Americans were now able to generate sorties, and not with the P-51 now able to reach any target in Germany. Galland understood this in real time. He wrote in the immediate aftermath of Big Week that the Luftwaffe had lost the air war over Germany, not the battle, the war. The distinction mattered to him. A battle could be reversed. A war, when the structural conditions had shifted irreversibly, could not. He was right. The precise figure he used in a report that somehow survived the war and is preserved in the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz was this. The Luftwaffe had lost, in the week of the 20th to the 25th of February 1944, more experienced fighter pilots than it could replace in 6 months of training. Given that the Americans were now flying missions at this intensity not once a week but multiple times a week, the mathematics were not complicated. He wrote, "We have lost the air war." 4 words. Wir haben den Luftkrieg verloren. Göring told him to rewrite the report. He declined again. Part 4. The Forensic Verdict. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. Adolf Galland did not lose the air war over Germany. He saw it being lost, reported it accurately, and was prevented by the institutional pathologies of the Luftwaffe's command structure from taking the steps that might have delayed the outcome. The distinction matters because the mythology that grew up around Galland after the war, the maverick genius thwarted by incompetent superiors, is both true and misleading. It is true that his superiors were, in critical respects, incompetent. It is misleading because it implies that competent leadership would have produced a different outcome. The structural disadvantages the Luftwaffe faced by the beginning of 1944 were not the product of individual failures. They were the product of a system. Consider the arithmetic. By February of 1944, the United States was producing approximately 5,000 aircraft per month. Germany was producing approximately 1,900. The United States was training approximately 90,000 pilots per year. Germany was training approximately 27,000, of whom a significant proportion were killed in training accidents due to the compression of the training syllabus. The American pilot who arrived at an 8th Air Force fighter group in the spring of 1944 had logged approximately 350 flying hours before his first combat mission. The Luftwaffe pilot arriving at a Jagdgeschwader in the same period had logged approximately 110. Stop and think about what 110 hours means. It means a pilot who can take off and land, who has fired his guns at a towed target, who has flown formation in good weather. It does not mean a pilot who can survive a turning fight at 30,000 feet with a man who has been doing this for 2 years. It does not mean a pilot who can execute the Bf-109's tricky landing characteristics under combat stress. The Bf-109, for all its virtues, had a narrow track undercarriage and a powerful torque effect on takeoff that killed inexperienced pilots with a regularity that the Luftwaffe's accident reports record in careful, bureaucratic detail. The pilot shortage was not a consequence of Big Week. Big Week made it visible and irreversible. The shortage had been building since Stalingrad, since Tunisia, since the grinding attrition of the Eastern Front, where the Luftwaffe was simultaneously fighting a massive land support air war that consumed aircraft and pilots at a rate that the training system could not match. By the beginning of 1943, the Jagdwaffe, the fighter arm, was being asked to defend the Reich against the growing Anglo-American bomber offensive in the West, support ground operations on the Eastern Front, cover the Mediterranean, and somehow maintain operational readiness across all three theatres simultaneously. It was an impossible ask. Galland had been saying so, in writing, since the middle of 1942. His specific recommendation, made repeatedly and repeatedly overruled, was concentration. Pull the fighter force back from the Eastern Front, accept the tactical consequences, and concentrate everything available for the defense of the Reich against the bomber offensive. The bomber offensive was the existential threat. The Eastern Front was a catastrophe, but it was a land catastrophe. The Wehrmacht could fight it with infantry and artillery. The bomber offensive was destroying the industrial base that made all other fighting possible. Prioritize the existential threat. This was correct strategic analysis. It was also politically impossible. Hitler would not accept the withdrawal of fighter support from the Eastern Front. Goering would not advocate for it, because advocating for it meant admitting the severity of the situation in the West. And so the Jagdwaffe continued to fight everywhere and was ground down everywhere until Big Week removed the last margin that had allowed the fiction of adequacy to persist. Now think about what Galland was asking for when he asked Goering for Spitfires. He was not being facetious. He was making a point about quality, specifically about the qualitative gap between what the RAF had and what the Luftwaffe had in terms of aircraft matched to the specific combat environment of the air war over Germany. The Spitfire request was a provocation, a way of making Goering understand that the situation was serious enough that Galland would rather have enemy aircraft than continue with the current allocation of resources. It was also, characteristically, honest. Galland genuinely believed, based on his combat experience, that the Spitfire's performance envelope was better suited to the defensive role the Jagdwaffe was being forced into than the Bf 109. Goering heard it as insubordination. He was not wrong, it was insubordination, but it was also accurate. The pilots Galland was fighting with in the spring of 1944 were not, by and large, the men who had won the Battle of Britain. Most of those men were dead, or prisoners, or flying in staff positions. The men filling the cockpits of the Jagdwaffe's Bf 109s and FW 190s in the months after Big Week were products of an accelerated training system that had traded depth for throughput. They were brave, they were willing, they were dying at a rate that shocked even the Luftwaffe's own statisticians. The Americans, meanwhile, were getting better. This is the detail that tends to get lost in the narrative of the air war, which focuses heavily on the German side's decline. American fighter pilots flying over Germany in the spring of 1944 were not the same men who had struggled through the early escort missions of 1942. The survivors of those missions had 2 years of combat experience. They had developed tactics, the finger four formation, the tactical pair, the aggressive pursuit doctrine, that were matched to the specific demands of long-range escort in contested airspace. They had aircraft, the P-51D in particular, that gave them a genuine performance advantage at the altitudes where the critical fighting was happening. And they had numbers, not just in aircraft, but in experienced pilots. Galland wrote about the American pilots he encountered in the spring of 1944 with a precision and a lack of condescension that is notable in the context of wartime military writing. He did not dismiss them as amateurs or as lucky. He wrote in a passage from his memoir, Die Ersten und die Letzten, the first and the last, that the American fighter pilots had achieved what he had feared since the autumn of 1943. They had combined technical quality with tactical maturity and numerical superiority in a combination that the Jagdwaffe could not match. He wrote, they were very good. 3 words in the original German. Sie waren sehr gut. From Galland, who had 104 aerial victories and had spent 4 years watching the best fighter pilots in the world try to kill him, this was not faint praise. Let's trace the biographies of the men who made Big Week possible. Hubert Zemke, who had commanded the 56th Fighter Group through the development of American escort doctrine, was shot down over Germany on the 30th of October 1944, when the P-51 he was flying lost the wing in severe turbulence. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner at Stalag Luft 1 in Barth, Germany. After the war, he remained in the Air Force, retired as a colonel, and died on the 30th of August 1994 in Oroville, California, at the age of 80. He wrote a memoir, Zemke's Wolfpack, that remains one of the clearest accounts of what American fighter tactics actually looked like from the inside. Francis Gabreski, who had flown with Zemke's 56th and would finish the war as the highest-scoring American ace in Europe with 28 aerial victories, was also shot down on the 20th of July 1944 while strafing a German airfield when he flew too low and his propeller struck the ground. He too became a prisoner. He too survived. He continued flying after the war, added 6.5 kills in Korea, and retired as a colonel. He died on the 31st of January 2002 in Smithtown, New York, at the age of 83. Thomas Christian, who had led his P-51 squadron east past the German border on the first morning of Big Week, was killed in action on the 12th of August 1944 over France at the age of 26. He had 21.5 aerial victories. He is buried at the American Military Cemetery at Normandy. Adolf Galland survived the war. After Big Week, his relationship with Goering deteriorated into open hostility. In January of 1945, he was relieved of his command, officially for insubordination, actually because Goering could no longer tolerate the accuracy of his reporting. He was then given command of a special jet fighter unit, Jagdverband 44, equipped with the Messerschmitt Me-262, flying combat operations in the last weeks of the war. He was wounded in combat on the 26th of April 1945, shot down by a P-47, the aircraft his own pilots had been fighting for 2 years, and survived. He was 32 years old. After the war, he worked for the Argentine Air Force, helping to establish their jet fighter program. He returned to Germany in the 1950s, worked in the aviation industry, wrote his memoir, gave lectures, attended reunions, and spent the rest of his long life as the most recognizable face of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. He died on the 9th of February 2003 in Remscheid, Germany, at the age of 91. He had outlived most of the men he had commanded, most of the men who had fought against him, and most of the system that had made his honesty so dangerous. Go back to that conference room in the autumn of 1943. Galland is sitting across from Goering. He has just asked for Spitfires. Goering is staring at him. What Galland was saying, in the most compressed and provocative form he could find, was this: the Jagdwaffe does not have what it needs to survive what is coming. The Americans are going to solve the escort problem. When they do, the qualitative and quantitative gaps will compound in ways that no amount of tactical brilliance can overcome. We need better aircraft, we need more pilots, we need honest assessment of our situation, and we need a command structure that can act on honest assessment rather than suppressing it. He was right about all of it. He was right in October of 1943, and he was right in February of 1944, and the 6 days of Big Week were the moment when the gap between what he had been saying and what his superiors had been willing to believe became too large to bridge. The Americans called it Operation Argument. The name was almost ironic, given that Galland had been making the same argument for 2 years and had been told to stop making it. We have lost the air war. Wir haben den Luftkrieg verloren. He wrote it in February of 1944. He was right. The war in Europe would continue for another 14 months, and those 14 months would kill hundreds of thousands of additional people on all sides. But the air war, the contest for control of the skies over Germany that determined whether the Reich's industry could function, whether its armies could move, whether its fuel could be refined and transported, that war was decided in 6 days in February, and Galland knew it before the last bomber had landed. The most remarkable thing about Adolf Galland is not his 104 aerial victories or his Ritterkreuz mit Eichenlaub, Schwertern und Brillanten, the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords and diamonds, the highest military decoration Germany awarded. It is not his survival, though surviving the war as a German fighter pilot who kept filing honest reports to superiors who wanted dishonest ones was itself a remarkable achievement. The most remarkable thing is simpler. He told the truth. In a system built on the suppression of unwelcome information, in an organization where the reporting chain ran upward to men who had made their careers on optimistic assessments and who had Hitler's ear and Hitler's temper to consider, Galland kept writing what he actually saw. The P-51 was very good. The Americans were very good. The Jagdwaffe was losing pilots faster than it could replace them. The air war was lost. The truth did not save the Jagdwaffe. It rarely saves the organization that needs saving. But it is preserved now in the Bundesarchiv, in his memoir, in the testimony of the men who flew with him and against him. They were very good. Sie waren sehr gut. Galland wrote that about the men who were killing his pilots. He wrote it with the same precision he brought to everything else, and it is worth noting, in the cold arithmetic of the air war over Germany, that the American fighter pilots who made Big Week possible, Zemke, Gabreski, Christian, and the thousands of others whose names are not in any memoir, were very good because they had been given what Galland kept asking for and never received: honest doctrine, adequate training, the right aircraft for the mission, and commanders who told them the truth about what they were being asked to do. That asymmetry between a system that could hear bad news and a system that couldn't is not a lesson about Germany or about America. It is a lesson about institutions and the cost of suppressing accurate information when the stakes are high enough. Galland learned it from the inside. The Americans learned it from him without knowing they had. If this investigation gave you something, a clearer picture of what the air war over Germany actually looked like from the cockpit of the man who understood it best, press the like button. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. And remember, the most dangerous thing Galland ever did was not his 100th aerial victory, it was his honest report, every time.